Now, if you allow me, Veronica, we would like to move to the second session, let's say the relation to agriculture and biodiversity. And I will leave the introduction to François Wakenut, who is the head of unit on biodiversity and conservation of nature in the DG Environment, and he will introduce the debate.
Thank you, Thierry. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's, of course, my pleasure to co-chair this session. I think the main interest of this session is basically to take us one step further from what we discussed earlier this afternoon, which was the general macro picture, which is fundamental, but now moving to the field, if we like, discussing the reality of what is happening on the ground, and one of the key interfaces between biodiversity and actors on the ground, which is agriculture. And I think that the way to look at this session is to perhaps look at opportunities which are often not taken into consideration. I mean, it's fair to say that the relationship between agriculture and biodiversity is not always an easy one. And I think that this is one of the issues that we need to reflect upon, because there are many opportunities that are out there that also need to be factored in, taken into account. And perhaps the objective of this afternoon is to go through those opportunities and see how they relate to some of the points that I've made earlier. Patrick highlighted a number of measures, incentives that can be introduced. How is this actually taking place at EU level so far? What is working, what is not working? What needs to be done to improve what is not working? And how can this be reflected in a post-2010 biodiversity framework, and also in the context of the reform of the CAP in 2013 in the context of the new financial perspectives? So I think that, in a nutshell, this is what this session should deliver. I am very confident that with the quality of the speakers that we have, we will get there. And I suggest that without further ado, we delve into the issues.
François. So I invite Christophe Koenaerts to discuss the agriculture and biodiversity report.
Yeah, thank you very much for this short introduction. We all know that agriculture is certainly by far more than the production of food. It's very clear that sustainable agriculture, that clearly means also taking care of the environment. Now, that is only one of the reasons why agriculture and sustainability agriculture are so closely linked with biodiversity. I want to address in my speech 3 topics which I feel are very much key. One is dynamics, one is birds. The reason for birds is, honestly spoken, I spent some time in my life with binoculars in the field myself. The third is, I want to address some options for private initiatives. Yeah, let me start with some very simple pictures. What you see here is a landscape. A landscape in southern Germany. There is really nothing special with this landscape. You see some bare fields. In the background, you see the edge of a forest. There is only something very special with this picture. At the same place, exactly the same place, a picture has been taken some years before. But you still see in the background the forest, the shed, a small road. But the foreground, that changed indeed completely. Instead of the large fields, there are small-scale areas separated by hedges, by trees, and planted with very different cropping types. Yeah, I would like to go even deeper in the past. And I have now the problem that there may be no photos available. I am so bold to present you a picture of a famous German landscape painter, Caspar David Friedrich. But you see here, and that's the reason why I'm showing you that. Also, this is a large-scale agricultural landscape. Here, a shepherd, a herd of sheep. Even the dying oak tree, a very famous motif, can be interpreted as the relict of a historical wood farming practice. Why the hell do I show you these pictures? I think there's a very clear message behind. The message is, number one, any agriculture, and you saw 3 different types. One you may call an actual type, another you may call a traditional, a third you may call historic. All 3 kinds of agriculture deeply influence biodiversity. There is no agriculture which is ecologically indifferent. The other is farming practices and agricultural ecosystems are highly dynamic. They are not static. That is a key feature of agricultural ecosystems. And the third one that should be considered, of course, there are driving forces behind these changes, and these driving forces have primarily social and economic background. Of course, there are also new farming practices which were developed. So that gives a little bit of feeling for the complexity, and I'm sure that this development will go on. Dynamics will continue, and the reasons are what we every day can read in the newspapers. We can every day write human population growth plays a role. We can read that consumption behavior plays a role. And we know all very well what climate changes will probably mean. So, clear message. Diversity, biodiversity in agricultural landscapes is not static. It's highly dynamic. That makes the situation already quite complex. On top comes that the definition of biodiversity is not so that it's easily quantifiable. Biodiversity, and that is one of the original definitions which was given at the Rio conference in '92, is very much holistic, covering all animals, all plants, all species, including the level of interaction, often mentioned, including the variability of the genome. That is, as I said, not easily quantifiable. Just look at the figures of animals. Just look at the figures of described animals, of those which have been in the hands of scientists and which have been scientifically specified. In Germany, there are about 45,000 animal species. Globally, about 1.5 million animal species are described. That is not easily measurable. And on top comes the large number of animals and plants which never have been in the hands of scientists. So that shows, and that has been mentioned before repeatedly, the openness of this issue, biodiversity. That leads me to birds. As you saw before in this slide, the absolute numbers of birds is relatively low. And that makes birds a little bit manageable, at least comparing to systematic group like the insects, which I personally like very much, but there are simply too many. Birds, they can be quantified. Birds are very popular. There is a lot of information about birds available. And what I want to point out here, birds are often used as indicator organisms, and there are quite good reasons for that. Reasons like life histories of birds are well known. There is a wealth of information about birds available. And they are responding, no doubt, to environmental changes. I see also some limitations concerning the value of birds as indicators. Birds are so intelligent, and intelligence means they're able to adapt to changes. And birds really are able, very much responsive to environmental changes. That means a good indicator should reflect, if it's a perfect indicator, environmental changes more or less one by one. And birds, normally, I doubt that they really do it. I see birds primarily as protection goals, and that is specified in a lot of legal documents. And the last sentence is undoubtedly true. The protection of birds is core for nature conservation. Yeah, a wealth of information is available about birds. That's what I said. And it's excellent that the European Bird Census Council published bird population development curves in Europe. And that gives a good view how bird populations overall develop. No doubt, as you see here, there are several species which show declines, Europe-wide declines. Some of these declines are steep, like the partridge or like the lapwing. Others, like a skylark, are a little bit more flat. But on the other side, you also see from these curves, and that's what you also see in the field when you observe birds, there are winners in cultural landscapes. Yes, there are also species with increasing numbers, such popular ones like the white stork, for instance. Here you see Europe-wide increases, or like the searle bunting, also here increases. Other have more or less stable population trends. Putting all this in a context gives you a picture like this one. It's a summary of 33 bird species which have been specified as farmland birds. I like this kind of picture since it shows you the diversity of trends. It shows you that not everything is declining. It shows you the complexity. Yes, there are losers, like the crested lark, which has the steepest decline. But yes, there are winners also. I hesitate putting this all together in one overall curve, since the complexity that is a typical feature of these ecological developments. On top comes that many birds are able to utilize successfully open agraric landscapes. Here are pictures of two very popular birds, the crane and some geese. And here you see development curves, development trends. That are examples from Germany in which goose populations, overwintering goose populations, showed clear increases, and the crane number, overwintering crane or cranes making stopovers during their traveling to south, also they have increasing numbers. And that's what's outstanding. That's what outstanding is normally the result of a close collaboration of what we call the private sector. Farmers, hunters, conservationists, landowners. This collaboration is normally the key of these kinds of success stories. For many bird species, and I do not go in any detail here, for many bird species, there are very well-developed management programs for the curlew, for the yellowhammer, for the little owl, the partridge, the lapwing, the skylark, the white stork, the bee-eater. These programs are different, but they are manageable in the sense, yes, they are developed, yes, they are validated since they have been tried out, and yes, it worked. Yeah, just to switch briefly to another private contributor, and that is my personal business. I'm working for the plant protection industry, and I don't go into detail since that would take by far too much time. But I just want to show you what we are doing. We spend really a lot of efforts to determine how birds are exposed to these potentially toxic compounds. And we are applying then this exposure to definite species which are specified as being relevant. On top, we are, since there are certainly uncertainties left, on top we are trying out on research farms how bird species can develop. Yeah, there are some very rough concluding remarks of my little talk. One is, yes, birds may find their own way. There are successors, there are birds which really are winners in cultural landscapes. Another quite famous statement is, yes, we can. Yes, we can. That means there are so many measurements available, so many management measures, and we can apply them, and the declining ones, they can be protected. And that is something, I showed you the little example with the crane and with the geese. That is something where normally the private sector plays an outstanding role. Then something that makes the situation a little bit more open, a little bit more complex. The only constant is change. That is what I showed you, and that is what is typical for agraric landscapes. Yes, change occurred in the past, and yes, change will happen also in the future. And when I think about nature conservation, That must be done under the big umbrella of the last statement. How much change is acceptable and how much conservation is needed? Thank you very much. Thank you. Now comes the response to my talk. Shall we?
No. I think it's.
Yeah, make it immediately.
Yeah. Can you?
Okay.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that stimulating presentation. Thank you to ELO for the invitation to BirdLife to come and speak today. I was struck in your introduction with your statement that agriculture and the environment are often seen as opposite activities. Agriculture groups and environmental groups are often seen as opposing organisations. So it's good to be here, and I think one of the conclusions I will make today is that we can achieve results when we work together, and there's an urgent task ahead of us at the moment to do that, but I'll return to that at the end of my talk. The publication which I'm responding to, which you've just heard described, and which there are copies outside, which came out this summer, came actually as a welcome surprise to BirdLife. It's an excellent publication, and I do recommend you take a copy. You've just heard a very short introduction to it there. There's a lot of interesting information, although within it there's one particular issue that I take exception to that I'll come back to a little bit later, but I'll tell you about that in a moment. And I think the case is well made that the unique agricultural landscapes of Europe come as a result of centuries of agricultural management, and the wildlife that we've seen, the birds that we've seen up there, are a result of many centuries of management and a delicate balance of activity and nature, which is what we have seen and what has evolved in the farming practices of Europe over these centuries. However, for many of these species, they're dependent, as you've just heard, on a highly dynamic balance between the habitats and the farming activities. And it's undeniably the case that particularly over the last 30 or 40 years, we've seen very significant declines in a number of the key species that we talk about. And whilst taking the point that it perhaps is dangerous to simplify any of this to a single line, it does help to focus our minds to look at those single lines, which summarise the data and tell us about the overall health of farmland wildlife. And birds are a particularly good indicator. There was a comment earlier that we have to be careful about indicators because they don't always tell you about what's going on underneath. The great thing about birds is even if they don't tell you anything, you can still enjoy them while they're out there. So they have a double plus, I think. And this is the European Farmland Bird Indicator that was just referred to. And it's obviously a somewhat depressing picture. And indeed, the latest European bird indicators came out, I think, yesterday, and showed a further decline in farmland birds of a further 2% between 2006 and 2007. So we aren't yet clear of this problem, and we aren't yet seeing a concerted recovery of farmland bird numbers and farmland bird wildlife. I think one of the messages that comes from this is that we shouldn't assume any longer that birds and agricultural wildlife come, as it were, as an accidental byproduct of farming activities. Farming activities have changed in the last 50 years, and we must now take a much more deliberate approach if we want to see this farmland wildlife recover. Across a range of different birds, it's fairly clear that this is the most threatened group of birds, collective group of birds in Europe. There have been declines in other groups of birds, for example, woodland birds and more general species. But overall, it's very noticeable that it's farmland birds that have shown the most consistent declines. And indeed, looking at the pictures that started the first talk, that's not a surprise. There have been very massive changes in the European farmed landscape. And it's no surprise that has revealed itself in declines in farmland bird numbers. And this isn't just an issue that's confined to the older European member states. We are now seeing, as it were, a catch-up decline in the farmland bird numbers in the new member states that have acceded to the European Union. It also this graph also rather proves the case that for those that point the finger and say that it's a common agriculture policy that's entirely responsible for these declines, that's clearly not the case. It's much more complicated than that. We're looking at trends in agriculture that are linked to technological change, to policy change, and to economic change. And you can't just identify one single cause for what is happening. The publication identifies a number of different factors that may be responsible for declines in farmland birds. And I wouldn't... can we move forward another slide? Thank you. And I wouldn't disagree with any of those that are identified in the report. There are 6 that are chosen in particular to look at. Clearly, the decline of historical farming practice is one that we've already just discussed. Getting the structure of the landscape right, again, clearly that's a factor at play, but also some newer factors coming in now. Climate change is a very obvious one that's already having an impact on wildlife and will have a much greater impact over the next 50 years. The report identifies predation as a further cause of decline. Again, BirdLife wouldn't disagree with that as being a factor that can cause declines in farmland bird numbers, and particularly with ground nesting farmland birds, sometimes control of predators may be necessary. The report also identifies the issue of introduced species, and this is the one issue in the report where I might take a particular exception. The bird there is identified as one of these introduced species in Europe. I'm fairly confident this is a printing error, particularly as it's identified as a waxbill. For those of you that are familiar with birds, you'll realise that that's something I'm sure that's crept into the report, as we all do.
Agree. That's a mistake. Come to an agreement.
However, but introduced species can have an impact. And finally, obviously, a process of urbanisation, and particularly of farmland abandonment, which is gathering pace in many European countries in marginal areas. This has a further knock-on effect on the populations of bird and farmland wildlife. But we have to come back to the primary cause in this, that the main factor in these declines have been changes in farming practices. That's not to say that these are necessarily bad practices or that they're being undertaken by bad people. This is a process that happens in response to changes in technology and demand for food that we all have. But unless we can agree that probably getting appropriate farming practices right is what we need to be doing at the moment, it becomes difficult to tackle the problem. And I think we now need to focus on what is it that we can do about farming practices to provide the incentives for farmers to undertake those things that are necessary to restore farmland bird numbers. Can we move on again? And again. Yeah. Next one. Yeah, thank you. One of the factors that we do need to address is that part of the package that we offer people in terms of what individual farmers can offer is we do need a sensible, robust, agreed baseline standard of farming practice. For example, one of the major causes of wildlife declines and one of the major issues in terms of the interaction between agriculture and climate change is the retention of our natural habitats and our natural grasslands. It's really no longer acceptable that we can trade away the stored carbon that we have in our soils and the habitats that are offered by grassland for both farmland birds and other farmland wildlife. So part of what we need to be doing is make sure that we agree at a European level what is the appropriate baseline standard of practice that we expect from farmers in return for the basic payments that they're offered. But that's clearly only part of the equation. Something else we need to do, particularly in terms of the contribution that policymakers can make, think ahead about what the impact of policy changes might be on farmland wildlife. A particular example that we could cite would be the impact of the abolition of set-aside, which came forward as an understandable response to tightening global grain supplies 2 or 3 years ago. But it was clearly the case that the abolition of set-aside could have a major impact on farmland wildlife, because in many parts of Europe it was only set-aside that was creating the habitats that were available on a large scale for farmland birds and farmland wildlife to use. So a limited provision was made during the health check to address some of the problems that were likely through the abolition of set-aside. But they were by no means enough, And by thinking ahead of how these policy changes can impact, we can actually address these things and ensure that the impacts are at least mitigated. That doesn't mean to say that these policies need to stay the same forever. Clearly, in the environment in which we find ourselves now, a policy of set-aside to control production is no longer appropriate. But set-aside had environmental benefits, and it's necessary to make sure that we put in place policies that can address those benefits when they're lost. I turn finally to the issue of the agri-environment schemes and the possibility of making payments to farmers to provide them the incentives for the goods that they provide for wider society. This is clearly a crucial part of the package here, and unless we can identify a common cause on this issue, as has already been discussed this afternoon, the EU budget crisis is going to force us into some very, very difficult decisions. A lot of the benefits of ecosystem services that Patrick den Brink identified earlier need to be rewarded. And I think the major change in the equation that we now have is that we do understand the science of how we can make sure that farmland wildlife can recover. I'd conclude by saying that I think the main thing we need to focus on now is clearly the next EU budget round and the reform of the CAP, which is going to be crucial to the future, and the next one, thank you, to the future health of farm and wildlife. We need agri-environment schemes, in other words, reward for farmers who want to do the right things for farm and wildlife, to be available throughout Europe. We need to be sure that these schemes are delivering results, and that inevitably means that we need to think about a big shift in the way that we operate the Common Agriculture Policy. But underlying this, clearly a huge threat now with climate change. This is just a map to illustrate the way in which farmland birds will actually, projections that we've done in BirdLife about where their range will change over the next 50 years. We need to make sure that the farmland landscape is in a state that can accommodate these huge changes. Otherwise, many of these birds are likely to become extinct. Next one. Finally, I just repeat my assertion. The EU budget is clearly an indication this is a time to work together on these issues. We need to work together to defend the budget that's available for agriculture and the environment, but that doesn't mean that we need to defend the status quo. We need to start talking together about the changes we need to see to make sure that budget is defensible and that the society will want to take the private offer that's available from farmers and landowners. Thank you. Thank you. Should have given you a clear signal about that.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that we should hear the third presentation now before opening the debate for discussion, to give all the speakers the same chance to express themselves before we go into a more open discussion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much to have invited Syngenta to participate at this panel. We have talked about birds, we will talk about farms and bumblebees and pollinators, but first, Syngenta is a company that has been around in different forms for over 80 years, and in that time, our driving force has been to research, develop, and provide farmers with access to innovative technology like seeds and crop protection that can help agriculture to push back the boundaries of its productive potential. However, no human activity, and especially not our activities, are without its impact on the environment, and farming is no different. So we apply our technology to help farmers to produce what we need in a way that is as sustainable as possible. And today it has been even more important because we need to work within the limits of nature, and we use the resource that she provides as efficiently as possible. We are placing such demands on our planet that to do otherwise will unquestionably threaten our ability to sustain ourselves. So for me, the solution lies in making agriculture sustainable, and that is what we apply ourselves to. People are often surprised when we say that intensive farming, maximizing the use of the agricultural land already under cultivation, is of great benefits to the environment. The reason is simply that under low productivity system with reduced inputs, there would be need to be much more land that are productive, and that would be adversely impact land use, soil, and water. Now, So the question is, how can intensive agriculture be sustainable, both in terms of the natural resources it uses and the preservation of biodiversity? We believe that by harnessing all the technologies and practice at our disposal, intensive agriculture can make optimal use of natural resources and preserve and enhance biodiversity if properly managed. And that's very important for us. That has been discussed in the various panels. Yes, we can do something if we are striving for it. This is, of course, what we have been doing for a long time, but let me share with you a couple of projects that exemplify how are we putting our money where our mouth is. And the first one is Pollinator Project. As you are acutely aware, these are very difficult times for pollinators. Across Europe, their populations have been declining rapidly over the past 20 years, with several species on the verge of extinctions. One of the reasons for this decline is the absence of nectar food resources, legumes and vegetables, which are no longer highly present in arable rotations. And in creating habitat like what you see right now, puts back the vital food source for pollinators. Field margins offer the ideal opportunity to create crucial new habitat without impinging on the cropped area. Now, the way we have developed this is, first, we have engaged in the research project called the BUZZ project that was based in the UK, because one of our key research centers is in the UK. We had all the expertise there. And what we have seen is that we have succeeded to increase the population of bees up to 600%. We have regenerated one species that was on the brink of disappearing, the Bombus ruderatus. The butterflies rose 12-fold, and we had increase in other pollinators insects. That was a research project, small scales up to 2004. Then we went on a bigger scale, roll out in the UK up to 2008. That's Operation Bumblebees, because we were targeting bumblebees. At the time, 570 farmers joined. Now there are more than 700. We have 1,000 hectares of margin under this type of management. We partner with private sector like Sainsbury, and there was a link with the UK subsidy scheme. So for us, that was a great success. And that was a success because it really developed. So we went one step further, and we launched this year Operation Pollinator. Already 8 countries have joined, and Belgium has joined now as well, so we have 9 countries on that scheme. We target 10,000 hectares margins. We are partnering with government, university, food chain, etc., and we are involving beekeepers. As the results of what we have done, we have seen that the population of bumblebees increased by 800% in some area in 2 years' time, with, as I mentioned, this Bombus ruderatus. And in places like UK, this is the kind of contribution for private sector companies like ours, which helps to meet and go beyond targets for environmental conservation and biodiversity. And we firmly believe that if we want to achieve our target to stopping the loss of biodiversity, we need to involve intensive farming agriculture. It's a vast area, so we should be able to produce food as well as biodiversity. And in another scheme, we have in France 11 farms, which are real farms, producing with real farmers, real farming systems. And more than 5 years ago, we have set up this network all over France in different types of cropping systems. And on these farms, we have developed various habitats conducive to biodiversity, and we are now evaluating the impact of our works. The first findings indicate an increase in biodiversity as a consequence of its proactive management. Now, around those farms, we are working as well with independent farmers to promote biodiversity. For example, to increase the bird population, more or less the same thing that was discussed just before, and wild fauna on a farm in northern France. The key breakthrough had been the redesign of the fields to take full advantages of current technology. It allows fields margin to be planted with hedges and filled with grasses that attract beneficial insects. Hedges have been trimmed to allow the movement of the machinery, but as well to allow partridges to protect themselves from predators. On some of these borders, rows of corn and cabbage are planted to provide food to the wild animals. So here is the map of our 11 farms all over France. We are developing no-till agriculture to save carbon and increasing the earthworm population. The crop productivity of the farms are the same that for the neighboring farms, but their biodiversity is by far higher. Birds numbers have also been multiplied by a factor of 8. Farming for wildlife is not obvious and not necessarily intuitive. It may require the redesign of your productive assets, and it requires strong motivation, investment and advice, training and practical demonstration. On top of that, those integrated policies are needed, for example, improving farmland habitat and tackling diffuse pollution that may be pursued together with the same means. Policies in place could be simplified or be more flexible, but if properly implemented, they have the potential to deliver great biodiversity benefits. We go even a step further. We are training farmers to count biodiversity. On one of our Ageris farms here is Château-les-Vergnes in Bordeaux with Earthwatch, an NGO. We are working with them to try to infuse the farmers, but as well our whole organization with our approach to sustainable agriculture production. Syngenta employees now have the opportunity to take part in field expeditions to learn how agriculture and conservation work together in practice. This feedback is very, very important and positive for our staff. This is a dedication of our people who first invented those schemes that is at the heart of those efforts. And they do this because they passionately believe in sustainable production. So in conclusion, all these examples which I have shared with you today show that we firmly believe that to bring the potential of plant alive, we need biodiversity, and we are committed to its preservation and to its increase. We don't have all the answers, but I believe we in the private sectors as much part of the solution as any other stakeholder. Indeed, in some cases, we can move faster and with greater effects. But what we really need to do is to combine all our efforts to ensure that we grow what we need, whilst at the same time conserving the environment and promoting biodiversity. One of the key questions that we have is, our schemes are working. For the pollinators, yes, we can increase the number of farmers, but with such schemes of Ageris farms, what we need, we show that it does work. What we need is a mechanism so that it can be extended to other farmers and then liberate this third generation way of farming. So I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all three speakers. I think that we have actually touched upon most of the issues that ought to be on the table, whether it be the quantitative aspects, if I may express it like this, in relation to how agriculture impacts on the space that needs to be there also in biodiversity terms. That has been touched upon by several of the speakers. The qualitative aspects, which relate to what type of agriculture, what type of practices in order to deliver both for agriculture and for biodiversity. And then what means to be considered, what kind of schemes to be considered. We discussed on this side of the table some of the more macro level schemes in relation to the CAP. And on this side of the table, we, I think, got a very interesting overview of what more macro level initiatives can deliver. So my very pragmatic question in terms of some of the macro level schemes that are in place and which have been discussed by some of the speakers already is the following. I mean, to what extent do you consider that we are capitalizing upon those schemes to a sufficient extent? I mean, what I have in mind here is that I consider that the CAP as such offers a great wealth of opportunities in terms of biodiversity protection. Now, when one looks at the uptake of biodiversity money available from the CAP, it is not always that clear that all the opportunities are seized. So it would be very interesting to hear from the practitioner's side as well as from the side of RSPB or Syngenta, what impediments there are to the uptake of the funding that is available. Because I think that in order to arm the biodiversity actors for the forthcoming discussions on the future financial perspectives, it will be essential to demonstrate that the money that is available already today is used to a sufficient extent.
Thank you. Yes, I think that's an excellent question. It put me in mind of an earlier point made by Mairead McGuinness about leaving farmers to do the job. And I was very taken by the presentation from Syngenta there. This is actually, producing wildlife is as difficult as producing food. And we wouldn't just walk away from farmers and say, just carry on and crop and let's not worry about interventions from industry and from agrochemicals and the rest. There's a huge task here about enabling farmers to do what they want to do and what the science tells us we know how to do it. Now, the problem, I think, from the point of view of policy instruments is what farmers don't want is 10 people looking over their back saying this is what you have to do and there. So finding some way of giving farmers the ability to put this science into action in order to farm in a sustainable way, whilst not weighing them down with a level of bureaucracy that stops them doing anything at all. I think that's the challenge.
Thank you. And just one further comment from my side before perhaps opening the discussion to the audience is in relation to a consensus that I saw emerge through the discussion and which I see as very positive. I started this session by emphasizing that agriculture and biodiversity communities are not always, or at least do not perceive themselves as always being on the same wavelength. But what I see as emerging from the discussion today is that the focus, the increasing focus on ecosystem services and the maintenance of the provision of those services is bringing the different communities closer together, as there is a realization of an appreciation that this is a common endeavor in an area where biodiversity and the private actors operating in it meet. So I think that this is an important lesson also to be taken from the discussion today. Of course, it doesn't mean that there are no differences left, but I think that the ecosystem services debate is contributing to bringing the two communities closer together and making the necessary bridges. With this, I would like to open the discussion to the floor. Yes, please, sir.
Thank you. Could I congratulate Mr. Morgan on his presentation? He referred to Mrs. McGuinness's words earlier this afternoon, but in fact, she went further. We will all have heard Mrs. McGuinness earlier saying that she believed farmers should reclaim political and management control of biodiversity. Would you go that far, Gareth?
Unsurprisingly, no. I think the whole point is, and part of the essential thing that the farming community needs to do now is make the case that these are public goods and that they're available for everyone to enjoy, and that means that farmers need to be paid and helped to provide those for the public. And I think it would be a really backward step for farmers at this point to say, let's make them back into private goods. They're undertaking private actions which produce those things for the wider public. So I would say that's the wrong direction to go in.
Yes.
Simon Spencer, Butterfly Conservation Europe. Butterflies are a much better indicator than birds of... Butterflies are a much better indicator than birds because they don't migrate to places like Africa where they get shot by lots of hungry people. The butterfly indicators show that our grassland butterflies are declining very rapidly. And a lot of these are in the mountain areas where one of the major problems is land abandonment. And what people don't realize, or usually politicians don't realize, that land becomes abandoned 30 years after a very critical decision is made. And it's a decision that's made by my neighbors in my part of Wales, where all the sons are giving up farming. So the dad carries on farming for 30 years. and then there is no one to take over. And I would like to see a compact and a sort of an engagement between the conservation movement and the farming organisations. So I had an invitation as a part of a farming organisation as well as representing butterfly conservation to come here, that we need to keep farmers farming, particularly in the upland and less developed areas where it's very, very difficult to make a living.
Thank you very much. I've been listening quite carefully to what has been said here, and I think that there are several things to consider. Based on the fact that we can see some initiative taken by individual farmers in Sweden concerning the crane screws. We can see that the number of individuals that are visiting certain places in southwest Sweden increased during the last years. I would say during the 25 last years, it had become a very important event when they are coming during the spring. The public, they're going there to see when they're coming to Sweden, going further north, and it became quite an important regional event where people following this, and I would say that this is very important. I can't really say how this affected the population in Europe. But it certainly raised the awareness among the public and among the local farmers in the western part of Sweden that there are certain things that you can do to improve certain individual species to develop quite well. So I think there are different aspects of this. I do agree what was said earlier here by the gentleman who referred to butterflies, that they could be a very good indicator of a certain state of biodiversity in agricultural land. But I think from a political perspective, it's also very important to see how we can strive to develop certain measures or political you say political measures that could bring about the development of certain species, especially I'm referring to migrating species, because the development of the crane in Europe is very much depending on what we are doing in Sweden and what people in Spain, the landowners in Spain, are doing to develop this. So I think that there are certain things to consider here, that biodiversity is partly a regional or a national aspect, but it's also a common responsibility, and that's what I wanted to refer to when I made my presentation. That it's a common responsibility, not only nationally or regionally, but also in the perspective of the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for one more intervention over there, and then I would like to give the possibility to the speakers to react before we close the session.
Thank you. Alan Buckwell from the Country Land and Business Association in London. This has been a fascinating session so far. We've seen scientists, crop protection companies, farmers and environmental NGOs essentially agreeing that we have to protect biodiversity. Its value is understated publicly. My question is, I'd like to hear some of their views on, is this a responsibility for the European budget? I think it is. There'll be plenty of people who are arguing that it should be repatriated to the member states and done locally. What are the views of the people on the panel?
Right, starting from the right.
It's always the same question, who pays? And normally it's always the same answer, not me. Okay, so far. But behind this little joke, I experienced in too many cases, yes, funding is important, but funding must be done in a sustainable way. What means, please, no 2 years and no 3 years programs. Yeah, and that's, from my experience, an extremely clear message. I experienced too many cases where you had frustrated farmers, frustrated nature conservancy people, and a situation which was a benefit for nobody. So sustainable funding, whoever pays, is from my perspective a very, very key.
My view is that these are European and global assets that we should cherish. This doesn't have to be done at a European level, but it will be a lot easier if we do it that way. And if we decide to do it at a member state level, it's going to get very complicated. So I think we need to get that right now.
Bien évidemment, pour l'instant, l'Union européenne abonde, même si, comme je le disais tout à l'heure, et comme nous venons d'en discuter, la Cour européenne devient critique, mais sur tout un tas de programmes, et c'est bien naturel, elle est aussi également dans son rôle, il faut le lui laisser, c'est l'argent des concitoyens. Mais bien évidemment, j'imagine mal que la biodiversité s'arrête aux frontières virtuelles, donc c'est bien naturel. Mais je pense que il faut aussi, on a parlé tout à l'heure de conscientisation, il faut que les citoyens s'approprient aussi cette biodiversité. Parce que comment voulez-vous que les projets que nous menons, que ce soit des projets qui soient privés ou des projets qui soient publics, continuent à perdurer et que cette biodiversité puisse effectivement continuer. Si les citoyens ne génèrent pas non plus eux-mêmes cette biodiversité. On vient d'avoir un exposé brillant et qui est fait là par le représentant de Syngenta, qui est quelque chose de vraiment quelque chose de formidable, mais si les citoyens n'appuient pas ce genre de projet, finalement, je me dis que la Cour des comptes a peut-être raison, il ne faut pas la critiquer, il ne faut pas que nous-mêmes, nous critiquions ce genre de résultats, si nous-mêmes, les politiques d'ailleurs, il faut aussi qu'on fasse un petit peu notre autocritique, on n'est pas capable de descendre, voir nos citoyens, et vous-même aussi les ONG, de dire aux gens qui sont dans la rue, la biodiversité c'est vous, ce n'est pas seulement le budget de l'Europe, ce n'est pas seulement les ONG, et ce n'est pas seulement les politiques, et ce n'est pas seulement les privés, c'est aussi votre responsabilité, eh bien ça ne fonctionnera jamais. Hein, je crois que c'est cela. Hein. Il faut aller un peu plus loin et un petit peu plus loin. C'est à nous aussi de descendre, expliquer ça aux gens. Et alors, effectivement, ce sont des termes qui sont compliqués, ce sont des outils qui sont compliqués, mais ça, est-ce que les citoyens ont besoin de comprendre les outils? Très franchement, peut-être pas. Il faut leur expliquer un petit peu ce que c'est. Comme l'a dit ma collègue tout à l'heure, la biodiversité, qu'est-ce que c'est? C'est les hirondelles, c'est les grenouilles, c'est les forêts, c'est les ruisseaux qui coulent. Voilà, c'est ça qu'il faut que les gens aient besoin de comprendre, et que la biodiversité, elle est dès qu'ils sortent de leur maison et qu'ils descendent dans la rue quand ils habitent dans des petits villages. Je crois que c'est ça qu'ils ont besoin de comprendre. Voilà.
I just want to answer also to the question, saying that in my view, it is crucial that both the land managers and the green NGOs agree on a common goal in order to preserve a budget for land management and biodiversity. Otherwise, we will have just nothing.
And to explain where we are in our thinking in terms of policies, maybe naively, but we would think that biodiversity do qualify as a public good, that it could be a good justification for a next CAP rounds to be in that part, that it does ask something on land management, because there is all the corridors of biodiversity that needs to be managed and that needs to be taken into account. And we have been extremely successful to have our farmers to produce food. Could we have the same type of success in asking of our farmers to produce as well biodiversity?
Thank you very much. And just one last word from me on this question that was put at the end of the discussion. I think that I mean, what we're talking about here is also the subsidiarity case for biodiversity, and I think that it's confirmed by all the speakers there that there is a lot of ammunition to claim that biodiversity is a natural candidate in terms of EU funding. But as I said earlier in the discussion, there is a need to demonstrate that the funding that is already available is spent and well spent, and that brings us back to the question of the Court of Auditors. And there is also a need to convey a very clear message as to what biodiversity delivers for other sectors. I mean, I don't think that it's enough to just, take biodiversity for its own sake as the end in itself, because this will not convince economic operators. And the link to ecosystem services is there critical because they can see what is in there for them, and that applies to citizens as well. With this last word, I think that we have to close this session. I would like to thank very much all the speakers for the excellent interventions and the audience for the quality of the interaction. Thank you very much.